Your moderator today is going to be Larry Sagan, and your facilitators are myself, Cami Higa, and Odessa Kawai. I'm going to hand it over to Larry now so he can tell you a bit more about the agenda and what to expect today. And then we will go into introducing our panel members and officially start the webinar.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So we have the agenda up today, and this is what we're going to be covering. First, we'll start by meeting the panelists. The second thing is we'll be getting into some basic terms and definitions so that everybody is on the same page. Then we'll take on some of the questions about when do attorneys need to get involved, what are some of the recruitment issues and challenges, some discrimination and harassment issues, talking about people with disabilities and disability issues, and then getting into some policy issues around facilities, pregnancy, uniforms, tattoos, etc. We have a number of questions that registrants have sent in that we're going to be addressing, but we want this to be as interactive as possible. So we ask everyone who's signed on if there are issues in any of these areas that you specifically would like addressed. Please chat in and we'll feed them to the panelists. We've only got about a total of 75 minutes, and one of the things that we're going to talk about when we get near the end is this has been subscribed very heavily, so we want to find out from you if this is something that you'd like to have a part 2 in February about. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. John Murphy, Beth Murphy, retired Chief Debra Amesqua, and Sharon Tejani from the Department of Justice. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm the guy on the picture there. I'm a retired Deputy Fire Chief from Eastside Fire and Rescue here in Disick Washington. And I'm a lawyer, and I represent several fire departments here in Washington State, and I have a small private practice. I do quite a bit of work as an expert witness and a lecturer at various conferences across the country, most notably at the FDIC, which is held in Indianapolis in the spring. I do a lecture on training officer liabilities and training liabilities. I've spoken at the Fire Chiefs International Conference in Chicago and Atlanta on discrimination issues with Dr. Beth Murphy, who just happens to be my wife, who's a psychologist. And then I've also spoken with a co-counsel in Las Vegas at the Fire Rescue Med, and my co-counsel and I do an all-day class on legal issues for EMS organizations, and surprisingly we get quite a few attorneys, municipal attorneys. They're trying to figure out what fire and EMS is all about, and so we have a fairly lively 8-hour interchange with those attorneys. And then I write extensively for Fire Engineering Magazine. I do a monthly blog, and I also work with 3 other attorneys across the country. And every month they have a radio podcast, and between the 4 of us, we talk about current legal issues affecting fire and EMS.
Great, John. Thank you. Beth, can you just take a minute and give a brief introduction?
Well, as John already introduced me as his wife, I am John Murphy's wife. We have presented together on issues of discrimination and harassment, where he addresses the legal issues, I address the psychological issues. So I'm a retired firefighter from the City of Bellevue, and I'm a psychologist. I have a private practice in the Bellevue area, and then I'm also the president owner of a group that John and I share, the M2 Resource Group, which we do speaking, expert witnessing, stuff like that, teaching. So my interest, my primary focus in my practice is trauma and traumatic stress, and then I do, kind of the regular stuff like depression, anxiety, relationship issues. But that interest pretty much came out of my career in the fire service. I was involved with peer support and worked a lot with my fellow firefighters.
Sharyn, can we jump to you?
Hi, this is Sharon Tejani. I'm the Deputy Chief at the Employment Litigation Section at the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division, where I work, enforces Title VII, which is the law that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, gender, and religion in employment. The Employment Litigation Section enforces this law against public employers, which include fire departments.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you.
My name is Debra Amesqua, and I was the fire chief in Madison, Wisconsin from 1996 through 2012. So I'd like to give a good shout out to my good friends Liza Tartar and Lori Worth. So glad to see you on. I had a very strong commitment to hiring diversity in the organization, and my purpose was to truly look at proactive measures that might reduce and or avoid potential liability within the organization. That was the first purpose. The second purpose really was to create a very caring and compassionate organization, an organization that reached out and embraced all people of all colors and both genders. And I felt that if you truly evaluate the incoming firefighters with the thought in mind of their character and the attributes that they might bring to the organization, there's nothing discriminatory about that type of review. So I spent my entire career in the fire service, which was 28 years, trying to promote diversity and understanding that it was important for the organization to change and the culture to change within the fire service. And the way you did that was hiring good people of color, women, and the right white males. And the right white males was critically important to our organization during the time I was there. And so I'm excited to be a discussion. I hope to bring up I've been retired for a year now, I'll bring a perspective that might be valuable.
That's great. Thank you, Deb. Okay, so just real quickly, when I've spoken with different organizations and different groups as we've trained departments around the country, people use a lot of the same terms and terms, but their definitions are different. So we had flashed up some terms that there's sometimes some confusion about, and we'd like to just real quickly go through it so everybody is on the same page. Fortunately, we've got two attorneys here. So the first one is Title VII. Sharon, it's up on the screen, but is there anything that you want to say about Title VII? Is it a law, or exactly how does it work?
Sure. Title VII is a federal law, and as the definition notes, there are also state and local laws that prohibit discrimination that could be more protective than Title VII is, and it's important for local departments to know that and to pay attention to those laws as well.
That's great. When we talk about harassment, because harassment comes up a lot, John or Sharon, can you talk about that?
Well, I'll start out, and I think Beth wants to say something too, that being that we're sitting right next to each other, I'm sure Sharon will want to weigh in. But you know, a lot of what we see in the fire service, and I know that I've experienced it as a deputy chief investigating harassment, but what we're finding, and the definition is pretty much what, you know, the legal definition would be that departments need to understand what their obligation and responsibilities are to prevent that. And what we have seen and what I've experienced in my own organization, what we teach about, is that sometimes harassment doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be in your face sort of activities, but there can be some covert or kind of behind the scenes actions taken against one group by another group. And it's very difficult to try to ferret all that out, because in the investigations that I do and other probably members of the audience have done internal investigations, it gets to be a he said, she said, or he said, or she said, she said. Those sorts of things that make it difficult to ferret out. But the term itself is fairly plain. What you see out there in the real world is not quite so obvious on an everyday basis.
Yeah, and this is Beth. I wanted to just add something about the definition of harassment. I mean, this is clearly a definition from a legal perspective. And so as a psychologist, when I'm dealing with harassment, I'm typically dealing with it at a level that has not risen to that legal level. And so, John alluded to, it doesn't have to be like really overt, but it's the covert stuff that really has a psychological impact on people, and that may never get to the legal realm because it's hard to prove, but it's very evident in the individuals that experience it and who witness it.
And this is Sharon, and
I completely agree. The law steps in at a certain point, but before then, certainly departments would want to do something about harassment that may not rise to a legal level, but can certainly make working conditions very unpleasant.
Great. The next term on the list is targeted recruitment, and I get asked this question a lot. Is targeted recruitment a legal practice? John, Sharon, from the legal perspective, can departments do targeted recruitment to specifically reach out to an underrepresented population?
Well, I think, this is John, you can try to attract people into your organization from an underrepresented group. And I can't remember what city, but there's a city that's looking at Somalians as a underrepresented group in their organization, only because there's not enough Somalian firefighters in the community, and I would assume that the population of Somalis in this particular city is pretty high. So I think that what you've got up on the screen, Larry, is pretty good. It just opens the door for individuals to apply, but I think the organization has to be careful about how they do their testing and all the other components of trying to bring a firefighter into an organization, so you're not discriminating, I guess, against another group that is probably equally as qualified. And so I think targeted recruitment is a goal that you would want to enable your organization to participate in, but you have to be very careful about discriminating against the other groups or minorities or ethnicities in your community that can claim a foul in your recruiting practices.
Yeah, this is Sharon. I think it's very important that, just as the definition says, targeted recruitment is part of the employer's overall efforts. And so there's a broad recruitment, and you want to make sure that you touch on all the different parts in your community. And if you do that, then there's no problem about leaving anybody out.
Okay, great. Real quickly, consent decrees oftentimes come up as a fear that people have, or a concern that if there's a lawsuit. What exactly is a consent decree?
This is Sharon. A consent decree, as the definition says, is a legal document that ends the lawsuit or breaks the agreement for the lawsuit, and it's enforced and signed by a court. And it's similar to a settlement agreement. Sometimes settlement agreements aren't signed by the court, but they end up having the same idea that the parties are trying to resolve their differences and have put that, how they've resolved their differences, into this document.
That's great. So we put together some questions, and we'd like to go through them. These are some questions that people have submitted, and then we are also getting some things online coming in. Paul Mannix had asked a question about whether or not targeted recruitment is actually leaving some people out. And Sharon, I know that you had said that if there's an underrepresented group or population, that it's okay for the department to do some extra things in terms of recruitment, not to be confused with targeted hiring.
Right. As the definition said, it should be part of your overall broad recruitment strategy. And so you should be touching everyone and bringing in as a diverse group as you can to your applicant pool and then running it through your regular hiring process.
Deborah, when you were in Madison, did you do targeted recruitment?
Yes, we did targeted recruitment, but understanding, of course, that we're looking at metrics that are a little bit different what most people think of when they think of targeted recruitment. We did go to many organizations to try to see if we could find people of color and women and white males that had attributes such as honest, were caring and compassionate individuals. They were hardworking and they were creative. They had abilities to analyze, and they had the abilities to make difficult decisions. And when you do that type, you're looking at it from a totally different perspective. And those attributes be measured in your formal hiring process. And so the trick is to go out and look for individuals that you feel can impact your organization in a real positive change in the culture of understanding, of course, is the white male dominantly your largest group. So, so you will need to really focus on those attributes that you want in your white males coming into the organization so that they understand they have the responsibility to carry on the mission of the organization, which is to create that caring and compassionate organization.
Great. We had gotten a question from a person from Nebraska, and it was the question said that Nebraska had banned affirmative action. There had been a state vote, and they had voted that there was no more affirmative action. Is there anything at all that department can do to try to increase minority and female hiring when the state has said that you can't show any preference?
Yeah, this is Deborah, and I think that the concept that we use in Madison really is issue specific, which is, you know, we weren't looking at numbers of individuals in the organization. We were looking at the individuals that we wanted to hire in the organization. And it just so happened we maintained that 15% people of color and women in the organization, but we also hired 100 additional people the time that I was there, this year, I was there as a fire chief. And so what you have to do in a situation where you cannot select based on or their gender, you have to look at those other attributes. And I actually said it's probably more beneficial to look at those other attributes than it is just the person's color or their gender.
Any of the other panel members got a thought?
Well, this is John. You know, looking at that question, there's been other states that have banned affirmative action through voter initiatives, I believe, and some legislative action. And there's a couple of the states that are it's found to be illegal only because it violates. I'm not now, but I'm not 14th Amendment. I may be wrong. They're trying to make sure that individuals who are eligible for hire are hired, and I think it kind of goes back to this issue of, you know, testing and your standards of testing and those sorts of things, and they will try to get the most qualified individual in to the organization to be, you know, a contributing member of the organization. And I think that these quota issues and affirmative action issues that have been banned, I think eventually will get overturned because it infringes on individual rights. So I'm thinking that the affirmative action in Nebraska will probably hold for a period of time, but I think it's incumbent on the employers, and it's mostly the governmental employees, fire departments, and city municipalities. They're going to have to wrestle with how they're going to get in the most qualified individual and not discriminate against, you know, those that may not be able to get in or may not be, you know, as qualified as the next candidate.
That's great. Let's take a look at some discrimination questions. One of the things that comes up a lot is a term called reverse discrimination. Can any of the panel members speak to what reverse discrimination is?
This is Sharon, and the way we look at it is reverse discrimination is a term that's used usually when it's a plaintiff that's either white or male, but the legal standards don't change.
John, any thoughts on reverse discrimination?
Well, I think there's a good case for those of you who want to read the law is in Connecticut with Frank Ricci. I keep pronouncing his name wrong. Frank, if you're on there, I apologize. But there's a good kind of process that led Frank to be the kind of the lead on this sort of reverse discrimination lawsuit, as it came in with a promotional evaluation and examination that essentially the city, I think it's New Hartford, tossed out the whole testing process. And so they filed a lawsuit. They won. Individuals were promoted. And then they received some challenges from some of the black firefighters in Connecticut related to the decision because they were unfairly excluded from that process. And so the saga continues with this particular case. I think it's a good example of municipalities, and I hate this term, but it's a good term, and not throwing out the baby with the bathwater when they're doing these sort of promotional exams, and maybe there's an impression that the ratios or the numbers or the people that got promoted aren't the right kind of mix for the organization, and so they throw out the whole testing process in the Ricci case. So I think, for those in the audience who may be city managers or attorneys representing cities, when you do promotional or new hire, those sorts of things, you need to be very, very aware of what the long-term legal effect may be on a decision that's maybe made on oh my God, we got to change this because there's not enough blacks or not enough women or enough whites or whatever that didn't quite make the level of testing standard that they put out there.
Thank you, John. We just got a chat question in around harassment. Is ignoring and isolating a person considered harassment?
This is Debra Amesqua. Answer that question because I feel very strongly about it. It is absolutely harassment, in my opinion. When you isolate someone and you make them feel as though they belong, they have nowhere to. And that type of harassment emotionally devastating. So in my world, Chief, that was one of the three issues that I felt was the definition of an organization that was not inclusive. And so if you have that behavior, I would recommend interrupting that.
Deborah, did you have any policy or procedural things documented that everybody understood that was the case in your department?
Not specific ignoring, but I think that as fire chiefs you have to demonstrate role model behavior that you want to see in your organization. And so it's extremely important to lead by example and ensure that whatever theme or whatever mission or what you have to demonstrate the type of organization that you see. That's the responsibility.
Great. Beth, did you have anything like that when you were a firefighter in your department?
Yeah, this is Beth talking, and hi Jan. Yeah, I think that's something that happens in every fire department, and I know that my research that I did was on women firefighters and stress. And that was one of the things that came up often. And I agree with Deborah when she said that this ignoring and isolating is emotionally devastating. It's a different means of coercion, either to make people act a certain way or to get rid of them. And typically people who don't fit the expectations of the department are the ones that end up being targeted. So they stand out somehow. And I lost my train of thought there. But it is very emotionally, it affects them emotionally. Most people, when they go into the fire service, they expect to go into a family. So they expect this camaraderie. They expect to be part of a team, you know, that their coworker's going to have their back. And so when they get in and that doesn't happen, and it happens to some degree in every department, and certainly that's what came out in my research, then it's devastating.
So Beth, but one of the things to consider is, yes, it's a family, but it may be a dysfunctional family.
Yeah, and that's probably a whole nother presentation.
Okay. So Lori Worth in Madison asked the question, if ignoring and isolating rises to a level of harassment, as Deborah, you described, is it actually legally actionable? Can somebody bring a suit and win?
I think I would defer that to the attorney, but my sense of it is that kind of behavior, that aggression, is going to be other more specific items that is going to experience. And it will just be rolled into, you know, or a genre of happen to an individual that they will take to court. So I'll let the lawyers answer specifically, but do you think it's a red flag for a fire or a person that is in a management position if you being shunned?
Deborah, you're fading in and out, and I know you're on your cell phone.
Yes.
If you've got a landline, it might work better. It's kind of fading in and out.
Okay, will do.
Larry, this is John. Can I weigh in on this a little bit?
Please, John.
I think like Beth said, and I think that what Deborah talked about was that there are certain expectations when you come into the fire service, but you know, and we want to make it like a family, I guess, or a brotherhood or a sisterhood or those sorts of things. And one of the issues is that the employer of the fire service, the expectation is that you have a team or a crew that works together, you know, flawlessly and safely and those sorts of things. And a lot of times the isolation or that sort of harassment question that was talked about is more of a peer pressure, not an organizational pressure. So the organization expects the employees to get along and to work together as a team. And so what you find out when you're doing these sort of isolation issues, you know, does it rise to the level of harassment? I think the short answer is it doesn't, only because there's certain personalities in there. But again, if it affects the work of that individual, if it, you know, if there's a safety issue, like, you know, some of these examples that you read about across the country where firefighters, you know, who's not in favor with the remainder of that particular group, their equipment is sabotaged, they, you know, find, you know, a whole bunch of egregious activities occurring against them personally, then I think that you have actionable, an actionable claim. Now, one of the standards is the employer, you know, the employer must know, or the employer's knowledge, known or should have known, standard is that the employer is not the social director of an organization. And so I think the employer, it's incumbent on the employer to make sure that there's training involved about what harassment is all about, how isolation activities affects the performance of one of the firefighters or more than one of the firefighters, and, you know, takes steps to maybe move people around in shifts, which, you know, again, identifies a person that may have filed a complaint, and that, you know, intensifies that sort of occult or below the radar harassment that we talked about earlier this morning. But again, it's a problem in our service. Beth has found it in her research, and again, we read about these sorts of things all across the country. And then I think the final legal deal is if the employer doesn't manage it or address it in some form or fashion, then there's going to be a complaint filed. And the complaint is usually filed through the organization first, and then if there's no satisfactory resolution, it will go to you know, Sharon's group or the EEO representative in your particular state, for an investigation into your organization. And my whole premise here is to try to keep the Department of Justice and EEO out of your fire department, but sometimes even though you have solid policies or you do the lectures and you do the training, that conduct still goes on, at many, many levels.
Sharon, did you have a comment?
I think that the isolation that the question was asking about certainly can be part of a harassment complaint. For it to be actionable under Title VII, the harassment has to be on the basis of any of the types of things that are protected under Title VII, so on the basis of race or sex or national origin or religion. If that's true, the isolation can certainly be one of the facts can be brought up as a hostile work environment, and Title VII prohibits creating a hostile work environment on the basis of the things that it protects. So I guess the answer is it can be, and it certainly can be one of the pieces of evidence that someone could put forward to prove their hostile work environment.
Thank you.
Larry, this is Deborah. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
So another question that came in really gets to, I think, how do you draw the line? So a lot of people in the fire service enjoy the environment in the workhouse where there's some joking and teasing and that kind of thing going on. At what level does that get out of line, and is it the responsibility of the captain in the station or the chief of the department to say, no, this does not go any further, this behavior is not tolerated? Deborah, you had some of that, right, in Madison?
Yeah, we did. And, I came straight up through the ranks. I was hired in 1983 as a firefighter and became a driver, lieutenant, captain, assistant chief, and then the fire chief. So I'm very familiar with the station culture, and I was playing the jokes with the best of them. But as you promote through the ranks, and you take on more and more responsibility for the culture of the organization, you come to realize very quickly that what might be a joke and fun and passing the time of the day on Tuesday can become harassment on Friday. And so as a fire chief, it was extremely important that my staff understood that there would be no horsing around as management. And we had to change our language. It was it was walking away from using the F word and trying to figure out more creative ways to express yourself as a manager. And so as you go through your career, you become more and more attuned to what's acceptable at a higher level, and what is fun and games as you were a firefighter becomes something totally different when you have to, take someone aside and say, look, we can't tolerate that kind of behavior anymore in the fire service. So I had that happen to me many times. I had to pull someone aside and say, I appreciate that we're here 24 hours and we have to get along, but please do not use that language around me anymore, or please do not say disparaging words about someone who happens to be a different culture or different gender than you are. And so I through my career, I've had the reputation of, okay, you can't say anything around Chief Amesqua or Debra Amesqua. And so I took that on as a compliment as I got further and further into my career.
Larry, this is Beth. I just wanted to comment on top of that. I in the fire service, I've experienced my fair share of practical jokes, and did a few things also. Nothing that was like targeted personally or mean-spirited, but it kind of it's a real fine line. And so from the psychological point of view, let's go back, like we talked about, like this covert harassment. So this is like one of the big issues, is that sometimes people use the tradition of the environment in the firehouse to pick on, to single out or target an individual. And then if they complain, then they're told that they don't have a sense of humor, and that's the way, that everybody gets picked on and does practical jokes. And the reality is that it may not be totally true. And so this, horsing around practical jokes, it can be used to target an individual, and then it can also be used to hide that harassment of that individual, because that is the culture of the firehouse. So it really comes down to having a policies, Deborah was talking about, is that you really have to have a policy of like, no, this behavior is not acceptable, because it's a great way to hide harassment.
This is Sharon. I just wanted to add that I think the idea of the policies are so important. I mean, the law has certain thresholds about it has to be severe or pervasive, it has to be unwelcome. But rather than having those conversations, if you have the good policies and if you have the kind of leadership that Deborah was talking about and Beth was talking about, you don't have to even worry about the first part of it.
So the key is really in establishing the policies up front. Is that correct, Sharon?
Yes, and having commitment to them the way Deborah described when she was chief, how she did it, and how she did it moving up the ranks.
Okay. If a department, and this question came in from Sue Tammy down in Tampa, if a department doesn't have discrimination and harassment policies in place, are they at risk for actually harassing people who might be the subject of that?
Well, this is Deborah. I would be very surprised that a department or the city or the community does not have some sort of policy about discrimination. If you're a volunteer department, your community must have something in place. If not, then there are federal laws that address this issue. I mean, you don't have to write down every single incident or try to even think about every single incident to have a policy on in your department. What you really need is something broad that everybody understands. And if you wouldn't take that behavior and show it to your grandmother, then you ought not be doing it. And so I think it's common sense, and use the policies and procedures that are out there that are readily available.
Larry, this is John. Can I weigh in?
Please, John.
I think that we create policies in the fire service because one person does one thing wrong, and you can't take any sort of action. And I think the question is, can anybody take action against me or somebody in the organization? We don't have a policy, and I think we generate a lot of policy because somebody screws up somewhere, and we go, oh my God, I can't discipline that person because we don't have a policy. And so, if any of the listening audience looks at their policies, most of them are garbage, only because they were created based on a single action by a firefighter. The organization wanted to discipline. There's no policy, so the response from the firefighter is, well, how can you discipline me? You don't have a policy on it. So they create these policies, and there's hundreds and thousands of them. I think the policies that the questioner was asking, and Deborah alluded to, were the policies that protect under the law. You don't have to have that written down, and most cities and municipalities and organizations have those particular policies. They probably don't really recognize that they have them, but they're held to that standard, even if it's not in writing, because the person who complains or is a subject of harassment or discriminatory treatment, if there's no internal policy, they'll go outside, and that's when you get all the investigators and and the potential lawsuits that do occur. And I think that if you do have a policy, and when I was the deputy fire chief, one of my most painful responsibilities was to go through policy with a committee to try to weed out the ones that are garbage and to keep the ones that are good and make sure they're up to date from the legal perspective. But having a policy is one thing, but training to a policy and enforcing a policy is something else. And I think it's important that if you have a policy, especially if it deals with discrimination and harassment and those sorts of things, that you're training your firefighters as to what the policy says, what the law says, and I think the organizations need to enforce those particular policies instead of having them in dusty old blue binders sitting on a shelf somewhere and nobody pays attention to it.
Great.
This is Sharon. I just wanted to stress that it's really important that the jurisdictions have policies about discrimination, in part because of what John said, that if you have a good, effective policy, the chances are greater that the employee will come to you first. And that's a good thing for your division to hear what's going on and to be able to solve it internally if possible. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is in certain legal situations, having an effective policy can help protect the employer. And so it's both good for the employee and for the employer to have strong anti-discrimination policies that are actually enforced that everybody knows about.
And Larry, this is Deborah. I just want to make one. I wanted to make one other point about the training component. It is not training to hand somebody a policy and have them sign the bottom of the policy and call that training. The employee must understand what the policy is. From their perspective, you need to know what they understand that policy to mean. And so it's much more than just handing somebody a piece of paper. You really have to train and get them to talk about the policy and get them to articulate in their own words what it means.
That's a really important point. One of the things that we can do in this online webinar is we can find out where people are who have logged in terms of policies. So we're going to throw up a poll question. And if you are online, if you can give us a response and we can just tally it, I think the point has been made. The department first and foremost has to have policies in place. And then second, we have to be training to those policies. And then the third thing is that we have to be enforcing those policies. But let's start with the first piece. Odessa, can you throw up the poll question? So just real quickly, if you are online and can respond, we'll leave this open for just a few seconds and we can tally this up right now. How many of you in your departments have these kinds of policies in place? Okay, so 96% of the departments said that they have those policies in place and 4% said that they do not. Can we get up another question to ask how many departments are training to their policies? And when I'm saying training, I'm looking at the definition that Deborah talked about. It's not just, briefing somebody, but it's actually understanding what they understand that policy to mean. And we'll post that.
Larry, this is John. While we're waiting for the poll results to occur, I've sat through a lot of harassment training and those sorts of things, and a lot of them are pretty boring, and it's only because you have somebody who just stands up in front of the class and just blats out what the law and the rules are and what the policy is. So there's not a lot of discussion. I think that part of these trainings need to be interactive to gain an understanding of what the firefighter or the EMT or whoever's knowledge is of what harassment looks like. And you really can't put that into a policy. You put examples in there, but I think having interaction with your firefighter makes a world of difference because they may not even recognize what harassment looks like, even though you try to define it in a policy.
That's an excellent point, John. John, do you personally do training for departments in that area?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Is that with you and Beth?
Yeah, because I think part of the issue is that, you know, most people don't recognize harassment or, you know, a violation of you know, a person's rights in your organization, this sort of concept of isolationism and those sorts of things. So from the psychological component of it, I think it's important that people recognize and understand it. And it's interesting because when Beth and I went both to Chicago and Atlanta a couple years ago and talked about discrimination and, you know, the psychological, legal aspect of it, they didn't want to learn about the law component. They wanted to learn about the psychological component. And so, you know, Beth was the primary speaker and I was in the supporting role to answer any legal questions, but there weren't any legal questions. And I think people understand, you know, they have a basic understanding of what the law is. They just want to know how it affects them as a leader in the organization, and as you know, a firefighter. And in order to recognize it, I think you need to understand it. And sometimes it takes a psychologist smarter than me to figure that out.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the policy and training to the policy. So, you know, having a system in place where you have regular training is always preferable to what usually seems to happen is that somebody does something and gets in trouble, then it's like, oh my God, we have to train now. And what happens is a lot of time that backfires. So if you have, you know, like a harassment or discrimination issue against a particular person, and then now you do training, it draws further attention to that person and creates a bigger target on them because now they complained and the whole department has to suffer. And so it's important to have regular training, not a reactionary training.
So,
Larry,
yes, go ahead.
yeah, Larry, and just to add on to that, the best preventative measure that any department can do on many of the issues that we're talking about today is to have an extremely professional, strong training division.
Got it. So just taking a look quickly at the poll, it looks like just under half of the people who are participating that filled out the poll question do not do any kind of this, do not do this kind of training to the policies. Are there any suggestions? Is there, and we certainly can get some resources up online. I know that as John and Beth mentioned, they do some of this training. Jonah Olson, who's a fire chief down in Latir, New Mexico, does some of the training through her organization, Cultural Bridges to Justice. You know, is there anything at all, other resources that you know, we can let people know about?
Larry, this is John again. Hate to keep dominating the conversation, but I think your insurance, you know, your insurance providers, and I think VFIS is one insurance provider. There's several of them out there that provide liability insurance for your organizations for drivers and policies, and they will regularly have people come into your organization, do an audit and whatnot. They have I'm just going to use VFIS as one, Volunteer Fire Insurance Services, I think. They have an excellent program on harassment. They have a lawyer that will come out to your organization and deliver you know, harassment training, and they take a look at your policies and they kind of craft the training to your policy if you got one. If they don't have one, then, you know, somebody needs to create one. But there are those particular resources out there, and I think that, you know, for the smaller organizations, and I think Deborah mentioned that having a strong training division is well worth the time and money to put together. But some organizations, especially smaller volunteer organizations, may not have adequate resources, and I've always been a big proponent of consolidating those particular training services. So you may bring in 2 or 3 other organizations to put together a training division. And the second one is that you can combine your resources and, you know, have a knowledgeable speaker come in, or somebody from, you know, your insurance carrier come in, you know, to either create a policy and to train to the policy. So those resources are available too.
If a department brings somebody in, to do this training, does that help to protect them?
Well, I think it does. I think Sharon said that having a good enforceable policy is a level of protection for the organization, and then training to that policy on a regular basis, either annually or every other year, basically puts down, because what you're trying to do in lawsuits is, prevent any, you want to prevent the lawsuit. That's the first thing you want to do. But if you're engaged in litigation, it's incumbent on the organization's attorney and the organization to make sure that you have a policy, you've trained to the policy, you've recorded who attended the training in the policy, and pick up any of those employees that didn't attend training. So it kind of lays the groundwork for a good defense. Now, you're going to have boneheads in your organization that are going to violate the policy, and so you can take some internal action against that particular individual. And so what you're trying to do, I think it's a multifaceted approach, to try to get the word out and to make sure the policies that you do have are enforced.
Well, one of the questions that came in talks about policies related to equitable facilities for men and women. Are there legal issues if a department does not have either separate and or equal facilities for both genders?
Larry, this is Deborah. I spent a fair amount of time working on this very issue. I think that there's probably not a legal stance, but common sense will tell you that you've now created an environment where mischief can prevail. And so as I started to build new fire stations, we locked into a concept that I called, a single occupancy bathroom. And then we would cluster those single occupancy bathrooms in clusters of 4 and 6 and 8, depending on the size of the station. And then at any point in time, the person has a private bathroom. And so the actual sleeping quarters would be surrounding that cluster of bathrooms. So I think that if you go on Madison Fire Department website, you can see the LEED certified platinum award-winning structure that we built that literally is going to pay for itself within a very short period of time and will last 100 years. And that facility is probably the culmination of my 28 years of being in the fire service and living in the fire stations and trying to come up with something that was equitable to everyone, whether you were male or female or whatever culture you were.
This is Sharon. Certainly different facilities can be a factor in a discrimination case if one group has facilities that are much worse than the other. And I just love Deborah's answer, the idea of designing it so that everybody can use the facilities equally and so that it's not a question of we're designing it around somebody, but rather there's a universal design and we all get to use it and everybody's welcome. It's just a wonderful way of thinking about it and doing it.
So again, being proactive in these issues is really the key. But budgets are tight, and a lot of fire stations are older facilities. So is there anything that Sharon becomes a legal issue about that? Is that something that somebody would file a suit about?
And they certainly could. It could be a factor along with other things, the other kinds of harassment that we've been talking about today. This could be another point that the person could show, and here's more evidence of the fact that they treated women worse. Look at the facilities we were given, right? So it could be, which is why it's important to try to do this as equitably as possible.
Great. Another question that came in is, should the policies and SOGs address the issue of minimum dress for departments when they have an open bunk room? John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I could make a smart-ass quip, but I'm not gonna. I think it's just in good taste when you're prancing around in the, a sort of a common dormitory area with both men and women. That people are adequately dressed. So the question is, does a towel wrapped around my waist when I get out of the shower suffice? And I'm looking at Beth, and she goes, "No, I see you every day here." So it's not a big deal for me. But you know, when she worked in the fire station, I think you know the trend and was not to expose yourself unnecessarily and to have good taste when you're kind of walking around in the dorm room. But you know, some people again violate that rule as well, and it's a matter of you know, common decency and respect for the people that you're working with. And I work a lot with men in the fire service, and you know, I have to tell you that I wouldn't want to see those guys in a towel wrapped around their waist. But I think that the issue is that it goes beyond the bathrooms, it goes to bunk rooms, it goes to privacy, it goes to respect for you know, those individuals that are in your organization of different genders or color that may be offended by you know, what you wear in a dorm area. I think again the organization, and we go back to policy, is to have an enforceable policy about you know, what's appropriate attire in a common bunk room. You know, what should you look like when you come out of the shower. And if you have common showers and common bathrooms because of the older facilities, and there's hundreds and thousands of them across the country, then you know, there needs to be this sort of mutual respect that sometimes it takes a lawsuit or a strongly enforced policy to put into place to make sure that people's rights are respected, and certainly their sensitivities are respected as well.
Two of the other issues that people responded to were about pregnancy policies and tattoo policies. Any input on that?
Yeah, this is Deborah. I did some work on this issue. I chose not to have a pregnancy policy specific to women. I chose rather to have a policy whereby if a male or a female had a newborn, or they were newly adopting, or they had you know, a gay or lesbian couple adopting a child, that we would have meaningful work for them for as long as they wanted to work, and as long as their doctor gave them permission to work. And then once their doctor decided that they needed to take time off, then they got that time off. And I felt much more comfortable having a general policy like that, so that it was able to be incorporated for many situations that I couldn't even foresee into the future.
Any other of the panel members have a thought about that?
Yeah, Larry, this is John again.
Yep.
There's an interesting lawsuit down in Davie, Florida, that the city had a pregnancy policy as it dealt with light duty, but female firefighters in the first or second trimester were denied light duty, whereas the other medical conditions were afforded a light duty allowance. The city of Davie lost, and because they didn't administer their policy equitably across, you know, to the genders. And so I think one of the issues that we see is that some organizations will put pregnant firefighters on light duty right away. And I think the basic issue is the decision to put somebody on light duty goes back to other industry of how you deal with pregnant employees. And there's been a number of lawsuits out there where female employees who become pregnant are discriminated against because they're moved from one work area to another. There may be a loss of pay or status. And the kind of the general principle that I like to advise my clients is that particular decision is between the pregnant firefighter and their physician. And so if the physician and your firefighter make a decision that I want to go on light duty in my first trimester, then I think the employer has an obligation to respect that. If the decision is between the physician and the firefighter that they want to take light duty in the third trimester, then that's the decision that the organization needs to respect. And so if you start to meddle with the employee's rights just because she's pregnant, I think what we see is the Davie, Florida situation. We're just kind of scanning the internet now, and there's a number of lawsuits across the country where pregnant firefighters are discriminated against, either because they're not afforded the light duty option, which they choose maybe in the first trimester, or the employer puts them on light duty unilaterally.
Thanks, John.
This is Sharon, and
Sharon.
what the law requires is that you treat pregnant women the same way you treat somebody with the same ability to work. So if you're a department that gives light duty and to people with certain injuries, and the pregnant person is in that same situation, then yes, you have to give them light duty as well. And so it's important, and I like John's example of listening to what the woman has to say about it and then treating them as if it were any other short-term disability.
Great, thank you. As you can see, we have just literally taken the top off this bottle. Unfortunately, we did not get to some of the questions from Karen Simpson, Leanne McKay, Mike Mannix, and we received them, but we didn't, and Mike Anderson, we didn't get to them. So one of the questions that we have is, would you like to continue a session next month to continue talking about some of these HR legal issues? And if you could respond, because we're doing our planning for our next series of these webinars. So if you could respond real quickly. And again, the more questions we can get in up front, the easier it is to address them during the session. So it looks like we got a very, very strong support for continuing this. So we will get this up. We'll send something out to everybody. I think just very quickly summarizing, it sounds like getting policies in place, understanding what some of the issues are, getting your staff involved in both helping to develop some of those policies so you've got their input, the importance of training, real training to and about those policies, and really making sure that staff people understand. So I'd like to turn it back over to Cami to close up for today's session.
If you have any questions, please email us at ff@fire2020.org, and please don't forget to visit our materials section after the webinar to view more great resources. Notes and a recording of this webinar will be available to all attendees, and we will submit any of the questions that did not get answered to our panelists and try to get something out to all of you if they can answer as much as they can. Thank you again to all of the panelists and attendees for participating in today's webinar. And please take the time to answer our 5-question evaluation that will pop up after we end the training today, and will also be sent to you in a follow-up email. Again, thanks to our sponsors, Scott, Lion, PBI, Cigna, Tenkata, Fire Chief Magazine, and Citrix Online. Once again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us or give us a call. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.